They say you don't realize how loud the world is until it's gone. I used to complain about the city. I hated the grinding gears of the morning garbage trucks, the distant, rhythmic thumping of a neighbor's bass, and the persistent, neon hum of the streetlights. But standing on the curb of Blackwood Drive at 5 p.m., I would have given anything for a car horn. My wife, Sarah, was already inside, her silhouette moving behind the frosted glass of our new front door. We had bought the house for a song, a Victorian fixer-upper at the end of a dead-end street, nestled against a thicket of ancient, light-starved oaks. The real estate agent, a man with a nervous tic and a suit 2 sizes too large, hadn't even haggled. He'd just handed over the keys and practically sprinted to his car. "Julian, get the last of the boxes," Sarah called out. Her voice was bright, but as it reached the edge of the porch, it seemed to thin out, losing its resonance before it hit the driveway. I grabbed a crate of books and followed her in. The house smelled of lemon wax and old dust. Felt like a fresh start, a way to leave the grief of the city behind. We had lost so much in the last year, mostly our peace of mind, and this silence was supposed to be our sanctuary. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, I went to the back deck to catch the view. That was when I first noticed it. A robin landed on the railing, its chest puffed out, its beak opening to sing. I saw the vibration of its throat, the effort of its lungs. But nothing came out. Not a chirp, not a whistle. The bird looked confused, tilting its head before flying off into the woods in a panicked blur. I shook my head. Maybe I was just tired. Moving day does things to your head. "Dinner's ready," Sarah shouted from the kitchen. We sat at the small wooden table, the only piece of furniture we'd fully unpacked. The clink of forks against porcelain was oddly sharp, echoing against the bare walls. "Did you notice how quiet it is outside?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting toward the window. "It's the country, babe," I said, trying to sound convincing. "No traffic, no sirens. It's what we wanted." "No, Julian. It's not just quiet. It's empty." Just then, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 6 p.m. The final chime hung in the air for a second, then vanished as if it had been swallowed. At that exact moment, the sun slipped below the treeline. The change was instantaneous. It wasn't that the noises stopped. It was that the capacity for noise ceased to exist. I dropped my fork. I saw it hit the hardwood floor. I saw it bounce. But there was no sound, no metallic ring, no thud. I looked at Sarah. Her mouth was open. She was saying something, her face contorting with a sudden, sharp fear. Her lips moved, "Julian, Julian," but the air between us was dead. I stood up, my chair scraping across the floor in total, terrifying silence. I tried to shout her name, but my throat felt like it was filled with dry wool. I could feel the vibration in my chest, the heat of the air leaving my lungs, but the sound was being eaten before it could leave my lips. Sarah grabbed her throat, her eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. She reached for me across the table, knocking over a glass of red wine. It shattered. I watched the shards spray across the floor like diamonds, the dark liquid pooling on the wood. Not a single sound. Panic is a loud emotion, but in that house it was a ghost. We stood in the kitchen, 2 statues in a world where the physics of sound had been rewritten. I grabbed Sarah's hand. Her skin was ice cold, and pulled her toward the front door. We had to get out. We had to get to the car, to the main road, to anywhere where the air still vibrated. I threw open the front door. The street was bathed in a sickly, pale moonlight. Our neighbors' houses, identical Victorians with boarded-up windows, stood like tombstones. There were no crickets, no wind in the trees. Even the leaves didn't rustle as they fell. We ran for the SUV. I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in jagged, silent hitches. I got the door open and shoved Sarah inside. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. I saw the dashboard light up, saw the needle on the tachometer jump as I floored the gas. The engine didn't roar. The tires didn't screech. We pulled out of the driveway in a vacuum. I pushed the car to 60, then 70, racing down Blackwood Drive toward the intersection. But as we reached the edge of the neighborhood, the headlights hit a wall. Not a brick wall. A wall of fog so thick and black it looked like ink. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, spinning 180 degrees. I waited for the sound of the tires gripping the asphalt, the crunch of the gravel. Nothing. We sat there, the engine running in silence, staring into the black maw at the end of the street. Sarah pointed at the rearview mirror. Something was moving in the shadows of the houses behind us. They weren't tall. They were hunched, their limbs long and spindly, moving with a fluid, liquid grace. They didn't walk. They drifted, their bodies absorbing the moonlight. They had no faces, just smooth, pale expanses of skin where eyes and mouths should be. They were the things that lived in the silence. And they were coming for the only thing left that still had a heartbeat. I shifted the car into reverse, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. We couldn't leave. The street wouldn't let us. We retreated back to the house, the only place with a lock. As we scrambled inside and bolted the door, I realized the terrifying truth of our new home. We weren't just in a quiet neighborhood. We were in a larder, and the sun wasn't coming back for a long, long time. The interior of the house felt different now. On the surface, it was the same Victorian we had walked into hours ago, but the silence had transformed the architecture. The shadows in the corners of the living room didn't just sit there. They seemed to have mass, pressing against the walls like rising water. Without sound to define the boundaries of space, the hallway felt miles long, and the ceiling seemed to press down on our heads. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the sofa, her hands tucked under her thighs to stop the shaking. I watched her lips move. She was crying. I could see the tears track through the dust on her cheeks, but the lack of a sob made the sight unbearable. It was like watching a film with the speakers ripped out, a pantomime of grief that felt more violent because it was muted. I needed to understand the rules. If we were going to survive until dawn, I had to know what we were up against. I walked to the kitchen window and peeled back the curtain just a fraction. They were still there. 3 of the pale, faceless things were standing in the middle of our lawn. They didn't move like predators. They moved like scholars examining a specimen. One of them tilted its smooth head, and I felt a sharp, icy needle of pressure behind my eyes. It wasn't a sound, but a thought. A cold, oily sensation that slid into my mind. Vibration is life. Silence is the end. I pulled the curtain shut, my breath coming in jagged, silent gasps. A choice was being forced upon us, but we didn't know the stakes yet. I grabbed a notebook and a pen from the kitchen counter. I wrote in large, shaky letters, "They eat the sound. We have to stay quiet. If we make noise, they find us." Sarah read it and nodded, her eyes wide. She took the pen and wrote underneath, "What happens at dawn?" I didn't have an answer. We weren't just victims. We were being adapted into this silent ecosystem. I looked at the grandfather clock. 8:30 p.m. The sun wouldn't rise for another 10 hours. To test the limits, I took a heavy ceramic mug from the counter. I held it out and looked at Sarah. She shook her head frantically, reaching for my arm, but I needed to know. I let go. The mug hit the floor. In a normal world, it would have shattered with a crash that would wake the neighbors. Here, it simply broke into 3 pieces. Silence. But the moment it hit the floor, the house groaned. Not a sound, but a physical shift. The floorboards vibrated beneath my feet, and the air in the room suddenly grew 5 degrees colder. Outside, the things on the lawn stopped. All 3 of them turned in unison toward the kitchen window. They didn't run. They glided. I grabbed Sarah and pulled her into the pantry, a small, cramped space behind a heavy oak door. We sat on the floor, surrounded by cans of soup and boxes of pasta. I held her close, my chin resting on the top of her head. I could feel her heart racing, a rhythmic thumping against my chest. It was the only sound left in the world, the tactile vibration of a living heart. Then the scratching started. It wasn't on the pantry door. It was on the walls. It sounded like 1,000 dry leaves being dragged across silk, but I felt it more than I heard it. They were inside the house. They didn't need to break a window or pick a lock. They simply belonged here now that the light was gone. I was the caretaker of a nightmare. A pale, slender finger, too long to be human, slid through the gap at the bottom of the pantry door. It moved like a blind worm, tasting the air. Sarah let out a silent scream, her body convulsing in my arms. I kicked at the finger, my foot connecting with something that felt like cold, wet leather. The finger retracted, and for a moment the house went still. I realized then that they weren't just eating the sound we made. They were using it to track our souls. The vibration of our voices, the clatter of a dropped mug. It was a beacon in their gray world. But there was something else. I remembered the mention of a vial of Pegasus blood in the Medusa reference, a substance that granted immunity to petrification. We needed a shield. We needed something to mask the noise of our very existence. I looked at the shelf above us. There was a bottle of high-proof cooking sherry and a box of heavy-duty matches. If sound was their food, perhaps fire was the poison. I wrote on the paper, "I'm going to start a fire. Not for light, for the noise of the flames." Sarah gripped my hand. She knew the risk. Fire in a wooden Victorian house was a death sentence, but staying in the silence was worse. It was like being the trophy of a race as mentioned in the space mission file. We were being kept for a purpose we didn't understand. I stood up and slowly cracked the pantry door. The kitchen was empty, but the air was thick with a gray, swirling mist. The furniture looked skeletal. I crept to the stove, my movements slow and deliberate. I doused a kitchen towel in the sherry, laid it across the burners, and struck a match. The flame flared up, bright, orange, and beautiful. But it was silent. The roar of the fire was missing. I watched the fabric blacken and curl, the heat radiating against my face. But there was no crackle, no hiss. The entities appeared in the doorway. They didn't like the fire. They recoiled, their smooth faces rippling like disturbed water. But they weren't afraid of the heat. They were confused by the flicker. The visual vibration was an anomaly in their static world. I grabbed a burning chair leg and swung it. It passed through the chest of the nearest entity. It didn't bleed. It didn't scream. It simply dissipated into smoke, only to reform a few feet away. They weren't physical. They were manifestations of the vacuum itself. I realized then that we couldn't fight them with weapons. We had to fight them with the one thing this street had stolen. I needed to adapt. I looked at Sarah. She was standing by the door, holding her phone. She had typed something into a text-to-speech app and was hovering her thumb over the play button. She pressed it. The phone's speaker vibrated. I saw the tiny cone moving, pushing air, but no sound came out. However, the effect on the entities was violent. They collapsed to the floor, their limbs twitching. The concentrated digital noise, even though silent to our ears, was like a physical blow to them. It was a lead. We had a weapon. But as I reached for my own phone, the floorboards beneath us gave way. Not a snap, not a crash, just a silent surrender to gravity. We fell into the darkness of the basement, and as the kitchen fire burned above us in total silence, I actually heard, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the earth beneath the foundation. It was the street, and it was hungry. The fall was a silent plummet into a grave of damp earth and rotting cedar. We didn't hear the floor snap, nor did we hear the impact of our bodies hitting the basement floor. There was only the sudden, jarring transition from the flickering orange of the kitchen fire to a thick, suffocating blackness. My shoulder blossomed with a white-hot bloom of pain. A scream was trapped in my throat, a physical lump of air that had nowhere to go. Beside me, Sarah was a ghost in the dark. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold concrete of the basement floor until I found her hand. She was trembling so violently I thought her bones might shake apart. We lay there in the absolute dark, and for the first time the silence felt different. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was a presence. It felt like a heavy, wet velvet cloth draped over our faces, clogging our nostrils and ears. I remembered the Queen of the Abyss from the archives, a figure who ruled a kingdom where air and sound were luxuries for the elite. We were in her court now, I fumbled for my phone. The screen ignited, a blinding rectangle of artificial light that felt like a flare. The basement wasn't just a basement. The walls were weeping a thick, black ichor that moved with a life of its own. It crawled upward, defying gravity, weaving itself into patterns that looked like ancient, forgotten cuneiform. The chanting I had heard through the soles of my feet wasn't a sound. It was a pulse. Thump shiver. Thump shiver. It was the heartbeat of the street, rhythmic and hungry. I looked at the stairs. They were gone. The hole we had fallen through was being sealed by the gray mist, knitting itself back together like a closing wound. We were buried alive in a house that was digesting us. Sarah grabbed my phone and frantically typed, "They aren't eating sound. They are replacing it." I stared at her. My mind raced back to the vial of Pegasus blood and the idea of eternal bonds. The entities weren't predators. They were gardeners. They were clearing the weeds of vibration to make room for something else. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I shined the light toward the far corner of the basement. There, nestled in the shadows, was a massive, pulsing organ made of the same gray mist and black ichor. It was the size of a furnace, and it was connected to the walls by thick, translucent veins. Every time it pulsed, the world around us flickered. For a microsecond, the basement would disappear, and I would see the race of women or the trophy world, a landscape of jagged glass and silver trees where sound didn't exist. The street wasn't a place. It was a bridge that was currently being anchored by our presence. The entities began to manifest around the organ. They didn't look like scholars anymore. They looked like priests. They stood in a circle, their long, spindly fingers reaching out to touch the pulsing mass. They weren't looking at us. They were looking through us, waiting for the final transition. I knew then that our phones wouldn't save us. The digital noise was a temporary glitch, a mosquito bite to a god. We needed something primal, something that belonged to the world of the living. I looked at Sarah. I didn't need a notebook to tell her what I was thinking. I saw the realization in her eyes. To break the silence, we had to become the noise. Not a scream, not a bang, but a permanent disruption. I grabbed a discarded iron pipe from the corner, a remnant of the house's old plumbing. I handed Sarah a heavy wrench. We didn't go for the entities, we went for the organ. The moment the iron struck the gray mass, a shockwave of color exploded through the room. It wasn't sound, but it was the visual equivalent of a thunderclap. The ichor sprayed against the walls, and the entities let out a collective, silent shudder. We struck again and again. Each blow felt like hitting a giant, wet drum. The vibration was so intense it began to liquefy the air. My vision blurred. I saw flashes of the feline woman and the immortal Medusa, their faces twisted in the same silent agony. Suddenly, the pulsing stopped. The organ shriveled, turning from a fleshy gray to a brittle, charcoal black. The ichor on the walls dried instantly, crumbling into dust. The entities vanished, not into smoke, but as if they had never existed at all. Then, the sound returned. Started as a low hum, then a roar. The sound of the wind, the crackle of the dying fire upstairs, the distant sirens of the city. It all rushed back into our ears with the force of a tidal wave. I dropped the pipe and covered my ears, screaming in pain as my eardrums threatened to burst. Sarah was on the floor, curled in a ball, sobbing, and I could hear her. It was the most beautiful, agonizing sound I had ever heard. We scrambled through the hole in the ceiling, clawing our way back into the kitchen. The fire had gone out, leaving only charred wood and the smell of smoke. We didn't stop. We ran out the front door, down the steps, and into the middle of Blackwood Drive. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. The street looked normal. The houses were just houses. Birds were chirping. A neighbor's dog was barking 3 houses down. We kept running until we reached the main road, where we flagged down a passing patrol car. We told them there had been a fire, a home invasion, anything to get away. It's been 6 months since that night. We moved across the country. We live in the loudest part of the city we could find, right next to an elevated train line and a 24-hour construction site. We need the noise. We crave it. But something is wrong. Last night, I was sitting in the living room while Sarah was in the kitchen. The train roared past, the windows rattling in their frames. I looked at the TV, but the volume was muted. I reached for the remote to turn it up, but my hand froze. I realized I couldn't hear the train. I looked out the window. The train was there, the wheels throwing sparks, the metal groaning, but it was silent. I looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand was moving, but the ticking had vanished. I ran into the kitchen to find Sarah. She was standing at the sink, the water running full blast. She was looking at me, her mouth open, her chest heaving as she tried to scream, but there was no sound. I looked down at my hands. They were turning gray. Not the gray of shadow, but the pale, translucent gray of the things on the lawn. I reached out to touch Sarah's face, but my fingers were too long. They felt like cold, wet leather. We didn't escape Blackwood Drive. We were just the seeds. The silence didn't eat us. It waited for us to germinate. And now, as I look out our apartment window at the bustling city below, I see the cars stopping. I see the people looking up, their mouths moving in silent terror. The silence isn't just a street anymore. It's a pandemic. And we are the carriers. If you love this story and want more contents like this, comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. Also, check out the channel for interesting videos.